We have just heard two excellent presentations by Dave and Eric about the Andrews and St Albans raids, respectively. They have stuck to the facts, explaining what actually happened. If you prefer a more fanciful interpretation, the cinema is the answer. Hollywood has always had the reputation of re-imaging history. Sometimes it's just a slight tweak. However, they have been known to completely lose the plot and present us with an absolute travesty of events. Thank you, Mel Gibson. I'm going to briefly summarise three films that are relevant to today's talks. In my opinion, they all come under the slight tweaking category. Well, let's be generous. Buster Keaton's 1927 comedy, The General, is loosely based on the Andrews Raid. It contains some of the most daring stunt work ever put on film, but always in the context of comedy. Exciting and spectacular in places, it became stock footage for many subsequent films and documentaries. It's typical Keaton, the little fellow who, with a mixture of luck and sheer bloody-mindedness, wins the day and the hand of a fair maiden. In this case, a Miss Annabel Lee, the General's daughter, no less. The film is unashamedly pro-Confederate, which is a little surprising considering Keaton was born and raised in Kansas. The raid and the Great Locomotive Chase were made in 1954 and 56, respectively. A different world back then in the southern states. White supremacy and segregation were still a fact of life. But with the emergence of a civil rights movement, time were a-changing. Hollywood was well aware of a huge box office clout of the southern states, so they didn't want to rock the boat. Any mention of the reality of a peculiar institution was at best only vaguely alluded to, and the tremendous contribution made by Afro-Americans during the development of the country were hardly ever mentioned. With rare exceptions, there were portrayed as cheerful characters, cast as maids, doormen, railway porters, and the like. Thankfully, Sidney Poitier broke the mould. In Walt Disney's The Great Locomotive Chase, which is set in Georgia, they are relegated to the background. A servant girl is seen dishing up grub for the white folk. One young chap is shown strumming a banjo, and in a little bit of what am I doing here? And a little bit of comedy relief. That's for comedy relief. A little bit of comedy relief. An elderly slave on a horse and cart is waiting patiently by the railroad crossing, watching the white gentleman tear up the track. The film also makes it abundantly clear that the raiders were fighting to preserve the Union. Any thoughts of emancipation were strictly off limits. The action takes place in April 1862. So the mention of Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia is a bit of a howler, as is the scene where the raiders sing Tenting Tonight in their prison cell 2 years before Walter Kitteridge actually wrote it. The hijacking of a general and subsequent chase is well done and doesn't take sides. 1 minute you're cheering Andrews and his fellow hijackers, hoping they will burn all the bridges. Next minute, you're cheering William Fuller and his fellow pursuers. We all know the outcome, thank you, Dave. Well, now, when Confederate cavalry come charging down the line with the soundtrack blaring out Dixie, it makes for an exciting spectacle. Pure Hollywood, of course. Disney now pulls his punches. The harsh treatment and brutal interrogation the raiders endure is hardly hinted at. Though the fight that takes place when they attempt to escape is fairly robust. The fight is true. As for William Fuller visiting James Andrews in prison to shake his hand, it's the case of don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Andrew's execution is not shown, just as well as it was horribly bungled. No need to go into graphic detail, but if the officer in charge had any sense of Southern chivalry, he would have put Andrew out of his misery with the old coup de grace. Now, Disney was a far cry from Sam Peckinpah, but The Great Locomotive Chase is the first Disney film to use a swear word. When a fine old Southern gentleman uses the expression, damn Yankees, he is told by his wife to stop cussing at the dinner table. Saying damn Yankees ain't cussing, mother, as you well know, is his retort. Now, that's fair enough. I've never heard Mickey Mouse say it, mind you. The Raid was Hollywood's version of a St Albans Raid, set in Vermont, so practically no racial mix. 6 prisoners escape across the Canadian border from a Union prison camp, join up with other escapees, and with the help of Confederate agents, plan to raid northern towns purely as an act of retaliation for Sherman's atrocities in Georgia, as they see it. Their leader, called Major Neil Benton in the film, now poses as a Canadian businessman calling himself Neil Swayze, visits St Albans to case the joint, noting where the telegraph office is, the location of the banks, and to suss out potential escape routes. He books in at a local boarding house run by an attractive young widow. And in true Hollywood fashion, romance blooms, which says cultivate matters slightly. Now, what follows is a mixture of fact and pure Hollywood corn. By the end of the day, the raiders, wearing Confederate uniforms that looked to have been tailored by Savile Row, rob and burn a few banks, force the local population to sit in the road and slow down any potential pursuers. They escape back to Canada, setting fire to a covered wooden bridge on the way. And if the old Great Fire didn't have worked well there. They escape back to Canada, setting there. The film hints that Mr. Swayze will be reunited with his new lady love after the war. Don't you love a happy ending? Yes. Well, not much more. The Andrews Raid was a gallant failure. They didn't burn any bridges or cause any major disruption to the railway system, and sadly, 8 of them were executed. However, 18 medals of honour were awarded in recognition of their bravery. A year later, a certain Colonel Benjamin Grierson demonstrated how a raid should be carried out. As for the St Albans Raiders, they didn't help the Confederate cause one jot. Well, a little bit perhaps. They were arrested by the Canadian authorities, who returned the stolen money back to the banks, but refused to turn them over to the federal government. This caused a major political crisis with Great Britain. The British accused the Confederacy of trying to drag them into the war, while the federal government accused Britain of aiding and abetting the Confederacy. I think Eric done it far better than I could. To their credit, both films demonstrated that there were no real villains but heroes on both sides who fought and were prepared to give their lives for the causes they believed in. Something that the liberal elite of today ignore as they try to rewrite history to conform to their own political agenda. Now, finally, I have been doing the occasional turn for the last 27 years. I am only too well aware that I am not a natural speaker, but you've always been supportive, and sometimes a few of you may even enjoy them. But Anno Domini catches up with us all. I am 81 after all, and my dear wife is fed up with doing all the typing. Yeah. Now, so you will be all relieved to hear that this will be my last hurrah. So, in the words of General Lee, with your kind and generous consideration for myself, I bid you all an affectionate farewell. Thank you.